Thanks so much for the opportunity, and I promise not to stand between you and your steak very long. So, Dare asked me to talk a little bit about, sort of knowing what the previous speakers were talking about, but how to target that selection for end product and meet the consumer demands. And I sort of added in my head, while balancing that with all the other things that a seed stock and commercial producer needs to select for. And what are some strategies that we might think about to do that? And I also want to credit my colleague, Dr. Weber, because as you extension folks know, you never recreate slides from scratch. You certainly like to borrow what's already been done. So thank you to Bob. But first of all, just to sort of think about this, and we've had great speakers today that have addressed this for us, is that we're not cattle producers, we're beef producers. If people don't want to eat beef, we got a whole lot of cows we got to repurpose. And I don't think that Hereford steer is going to run the barrels in 18 seconds. And I know my friends and relatives in Iowa don't want to plow a cornfield like this. So we've got to make sure people want to eat beef. And like I said, we've heard that today. And actually, a couple of these slides I put together for a presentation I gave to a bunch of engineers about the beef cattle industry. But I think it reminds us a little bit of the segmentation of our industry, where we have cattle changing hands multiple times often. Obviously, we have some retained ownership, but we've got genetics and cattle changing hands multiple times through their life cycle, maybe backgrounded, maybe not, processor, wholesaler, retailer, and eventually to the consumer. And we know that it is absolutely not perfect, but there are price signals at every one of those steps. I'm not arguing that that's a perfect system, but not every carcass sells for the same price. Not every fed steer sells for the same price. Not every bull sells for the same price. There are price signals that pass up that chain. And because of those price signals, from the consumer all the way back up through the chain, there has been that differentiation in value that has driven commercial and seed stock producers to try to make changes in end product traits. We've seen that over the past several decades. And as those price signals moved through the chain, our seed stock producers needed tools. Our breed associations have done a great job of providing tools to our seed stock producers to make improvements in those end product traits. Okay, those tools we have EPDs, we have indexes, we have genomics. Those are tools we have to make change. And do they work? And that's probably not a question to ask in this audience, because I think I hope I would get the right answer. But these tools do work. And we've got, and then just a synopsis of what we have in most breeds. We have carcass weight EPD, we have marbling EPDs, we have ribivariate EPDs, we have fat EPDs. We have actual carcass data. We have ultrasound on yearling bulls and heifers. We have data that make these EPDs possible. And yeah, they work. And I just pulled Red Angus because they make pretty graphs on their website, so I pulled that one down, but I could have picked any breed, right? We know that we've made tremendous progress. Seed stock producers have made tremendous progress in marbling in ribeye area over the past couple of decades. So selection works. We know that. But let's circle back to our sort of life cycle of the beef calf and think about those different segments of the industry. We had, great information this morning about what consumers want, and mine's much more simplistic, but the consumers want a good product. They want it to taste good. They want it tender. They want the right portion size. They're going to be not so much concerned about the birth weight of your calves or the weaning weight. They care about their product. So pass that back up the chain. The retailer, the wholesaler, the packer. We don't do a great job of measuring things like tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. We don't really do that. But we have a proxy, we have quality grade, we have yield grade. Those are proxies for these quality traits. And that's what that segment cares about. We'll back it up to the feedlot. They have to care about all that, but they also have to care about things like growth, like efficiency, health. They've got extra traits they care about. And back that up to the cow-calf producer. They care about quality and yield grade and growth and feed efficiency and health and fertility and longevity and average daily gain and cattle needs and ... You guys know better than I, right? There's lots of traits that we care about and that impact profitability. And I'm glad you mentioned this, Dare, here a few minutes ago. There was some classic work that came out, it's been a while now, but just classic economic studies that showed in a traditional sort of beef operation where cattle are changing hands many times, the relative value of reproduction to growth to carcass was about 10 to 5 to 1. Now, the integrated beef firm, if you had an entity that owned the cattle from seed stock through carcass, it was much different. Okay, the end product was more valuable. I think probably nowadays reality is somewhere between those two, but certainly reproduction is going to drive profitability for the cow-calf sector. I mean, it's pretty simple. If the calf doesn't exist, it doesn't matter how good a carcass he might have had, right? He doesn't exist. So we circle back. What do the segments care about? Our commercial cow-calf producer, our seed stock producer, has this whole list of traits that impact profitability. Reproduction, fertility, longevity of the cow herd are probably the most important. So how do we make progress in carcass traits, in end product traits at the commercial and seed stock level when so much of our profitability is tied to other traits? How do we do both? And that's a challenge. Well, and a lot of times we try to find one bull to do that. We try to find a sire that's going to make great replacement heifers and hang great carcasses on the rail. And that's what we've endeavored to do in many cases in our industry. So this is a fun activity that I have my students do. I teach a lot of students in animal breeding every year. And I tell them to go to their favorite breed. I don't care what it is, doesn't matter. They've all got online search tools, right? You put in your values and tell it to find bulls. And just put in breed average for all the traits as a maximum or minimum, depending on the trait. Just put in breed average for all the EPDs. I think, what did Troy say, 25 for Angus? Put them all in there and click go. How many sires do you find that are breed average or better for every EPD? Any guesses? It kind of depends when you do it. Most of the time, you don't find any. Once in a while, you might get 2 or 3 sires, but usually 0. And I started doing this when I have my students write a final paper, a final report, design a breeding system. And we've got great students and they're ambitious and they say, I'm only going to use sires in the top 5% of the breed for calving and weaning weight and marbling and on and on and on. I say, okay, go to the website, find me your bulls. And they come back and say, oh, the website's not working. It's not finding any bulls. So no, I think the website's working fine. That bull doesn't exist, right? Nobody's good at everything. Again, I tell my students, you're not good at math and playing the violin and shooting free throws and ice skating and. We all have talents. Probably a better analogy going into an Olympic year is think about a decathlete, some of the greatest athletes on the planet. But if that decathlete ran in the 100-meter dash against 100-meter specialists, he's going to get blown off the track, right? Okay, so nobody is good at everything. We've also heard over the years that we have this antagonism between maternal ability and carcass quality, carcass traits. And I think in the swine industry, there was some evidence of that. Back in the 90s, really heavy muscled, lean hogs had some fertility and some maternal problems. I did sort of a shallow dive into the literature the last few weeks, and we really don't see that. There's not much evidence of that in beef cattle. There was a nice thesis, Ryan Bolt's thesis recently, showed actually favorable relationships between heifer pregnancy and stayability and marbling and ribeye area. So I don't think we have the antagonisms that we might have in our other species, but we certainly don't have sires that are great at everything. And so, again, ties back into what we just heard. We need to have a definition of a breeding objective for a specific operation and what traits are driving profitability for that operation. Which again circles us back that if you're selling calves at weaning, how do we improve end product traits when the profitability of that operation is not necessarily tied to those traits? Okay, it's a difficult problem. But one thing we can do is that we can use mating systems. Okay, we can match maternal and paternal or maternal and terminal type animals and make different mating decisions for different end products. That gives us more flexibility. We can make heifers out of certain kinds of bulls. We can make feeder cattle out of other bulls. And we have not done a good job of this as a beef cattle industry. We like that bull that we think can do it all. Think about our speaker this morning from the swine industry. He was talking about that classic static terminal cross. He had Yorkshire and Landrace F1 sows, and they crossed them on a terminal boar. That classic sort of maternal-paternal complementarity that works really well. And we think about it in terms of a crossbreeding system, but I would also like you to think about matching maternal and terminal decisions, not so much along with crossbreeding, but also lines within breeds. We certainly have variation within our pure breeds. I remember hearing years ago, and I don't know if there's any way to prove this, but there's more variation within breed than between breed. Not sure that's necessarily true, but we certainly do have variation. Even within terminal type breeds, we have animals that are stronger in maternal traits than others in that breed, and vice versa. So we can think about designing crossbreeding systems, potentially even using cross-line systems within breeds. So it becomes pretty simple when you think about it that way. We want to keep heifers out of bulls that are strong in cow fertility, heifer pregnancy, stability, longevity. I'm glad I was foresightful enough to put appropriate milk and mature size after listening to the other talks today. Appropriate calving needs, appropriate weaning weight. But then we produce feeder cattle out of those sires that are strong in growth, efficiency, carcass traits. Separate those mating decisions. And many of the mating systems that we teach, that I teach, don't really lend themselves to this. When we think about our classic 2 and 3 breed rotational crosses, we're producing feeder calves and replacement heifers out of the same bulls. Okay, we're trying to find that bull that does it all. So some of the systems that we traditionally have used don't work well in this case. So the best system that we can do, and it's again exactly what our swine friend said this morning, is to have very specifically bred maternal line females, crossbred or purebred potentially, and then cross them to that terminal breed and sell the progeny. You get maximum breed complementarity here. You match the animals to their purpose, maximum growth, maximum carcass merit in those sires to try to produce that ideal feeder animal. Okay, this works incredibly well in swine. What's the problem for us in beef cattle? It's kind of one word here, right? We don't have a kind of a culture and a history and availability, honestly, of groups of maternal line, ready to breed or bred heifers. I can't get on the phone and say, hey, I need 500 F1 heifers next week to deliver, like I could if I was a pig person, right? We don't have that. And so that's an issue in our industry. Now, I would say there are some people that are sort of stepping into that space, producing heifers, bred heifers, selling those to other producers. So that certainly is something that might increase. But since the system isn't going to work great for beef cattle in a large scale at this point, we might be able to modify some other systems to work for us. And so one might be the Rototerminal system. This would be a crossbreeding system, or again, a line crossing system, where we designate about half of our cows to produce replacement heifers. We breed them to that strong maternal sire. And we designate about half of our cows to produce feeder cattle. And if you do the math, back of the envelope cowboy math, for cattle, it's about half and half. You have to designate about half your herd to get the right amount of replacement heifers. We assume, you look in the literature, anywhere between 10 to 20% replacement rate nationally, so maybe 15% replacement rate. So if you have 100 cows, you need 15 bred heifers every year coming into the herd. So you probably need about 20 heifer calves to breed at least. Well, if you breed 50 cows, you're probably going to get somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 heifers. So half your herd has to be designated to produce replacement heifers. Now there is some inefficiency in this system as well, right? Because of those cows who breed to that maternal line sire over here on the left, we get some steer calves out of there too, right? Okay, we don't get all heifers out of our heifer bowl, unfortunately. And so there's some inefficiencies here. What might be something that would really help this system? I think I just sort of alluded to it. Yeah, AI and sex semen really helps this system. Okay? If we can, well, there's a couple different things we can do. One thing we can do is not designate half our cows and half our cows. Let's go through and synchronize and give one shot at AI to every cow with a maternal line sire. Okay, synchronize and AI, what do we get? 60% conception rates if we're doing decent. Half of those are females, weaning rate. Yeah, that gets us our 20, 25 or so heifers. And then we go and turn out terminal sires. That's fairly simplistic. You only need one kind of bull on the place. You've got terminal sires. You keep all those calves out of your AI maternal sires. Sex semen helps us even more, right? Now I don't have to breed all my cows. I can synchronize and AI a portion of my cows to those maternal bulls and get a much higher proportion of heifers, and I have less of those maternal steer calves. The real problem is we think about, and I appreciate the question this morning, lady from Missouri, about those small herds. What do I do in a herd where I only need one bull and I don't want to AI? That's the challenge, right? We can't do any sort of, if you only need one bull, I'm not going to advise you need to buy a terminal bull and a maternal bull. That's not going to fly, right? If you have a small herd. You can't do AI, we really can't incorporate this. Those are the kind of producers that really ought to be thinking about this idea of the static terminal. Can I find a good source of maternal heifers or young cows and only have to worry about producing those terminal calves? But we also have the multiple trait selection problem on both sides of our equation, our maternal and our terminal side of our equation. And we obviously heard a lot about that in the last hour, that we've got lots of traits that we need to care about. And so we need to make sure we're practicing multiple trait selection and appropriately weighting those traits in our sire selection, both on our heifer sires and our feeder calf sires. And it's hard, right? We've got lots of traits we care about. They have different economic weights, trying to figure out the right index. But it's important. And we know that after today, that indexes are the best way to make profitability. But what we need to be very, very careful of is the fact that we need to get the right index. And I think we've been guilty of that, a little bit of an industry of using more terminally based indexes to select replacement heifers. And I don't believe that's how the breed associations intended those to be used. And the breed associations do a pretty nice job on their websites. You dig in a little bit, they describe the indexes. They talk about what they're supposed to be used for, and they talk about what traits are included in those indexes. And so those terminal indexes, whether it's TI or dollar beef or gridmaster, whatever breed you're talking about, they are designed for feedlot progeny. They are not designed to keep replacement heifers. They do not have emphasis or include maternal traits. Now you've also got, as Dr. Rowan very well explained, the maternal and all-purpose indexes that are doing something very different. Okay? Those maternal indexes are designed to produce calves. They're designed to produce calves. The all-purpose indexes are trying to sort of straddle the fence, right? Produce cows, produce some feeder calves. They're trying to find that decathlete bull that can do it all. But it's just critically important to make sure you find the index that works for you. And I think, as we talked about, iGenDec will be an exciting development to be able to customize that index and put in the traits, put in the parameters that work in your operation. And so I think we need to keep in mind that we need to make improvement in end product because that's what our consumer is utilizing. That's what our consumer wants. We've got to do that. But we also have to recognize that if we select for end product traits and ignore the cow herd, we're going to decrease progress in maternal traits. We just can't do it all well all the time. But we can use appropriate mating systems, whether it's crossbreeding or line breeding. We can use appropriate mating systems to separate those decision points. We can separate replacement heifer production from feeder calf production and try to maximize potential in both of those areas, make good heifers that go on to make profitable cows, and produce feeder calves that are going to do well in the feed yard, they're going to hang high quality, high yielding carcasses, and do the best of both worlds. So with that, I would be happy to try to answer any questions.
Questions for Dr. Bormann? Yes.
Dr. Bormann, that was an excellent presentation. I have a general comment that doesn't contradict what you said, but in recent years, the portion of beef carcasses that are yield graded has been declining pretty drastically. The minority of beef carcasses are stamped for yield graded. And so my point is that economic signals back to producers to keep some pressure on reliability and decrease fatness and so on have kind of been put by the wayside because dressing percent, carcass weight, and marbling seem to drive the value of carcasses and so on. And cuttability is kind of pushed to the side. Just a comment.
Yeah, interesting.
Any questions? Okay, yeah.
So as you go into a mating system and you target certain animals for a certain outcome group, by definition, because there's fewer animals in each group, you lower your selection pressure within that group. How does that impact your ability to make total genetic progress because you aren't able to apply as much selection pressure on the keepers that you're eventually going to use as replacements?
Yeah, that's a great question. And sorry, the question was when you go into these mating systems, and I'm paraphrasing, that you are producing fewer amounts of animals in those categories, and so you have less selection pressure, less intensity. And that's actually a scenario that we calculate out in class. I said, well, you produce 25 replacement heifers and you got to keep 20 of them. That doesn't give you much room to make selection, right? Because if she breeds, she probably is making the cow herd. And that's absolutely true. But I think at the commercial level, that's probably okay. We know that on the heifer side, we don't have a ton of intensity anyway. Genomics has helped us there for sure. But for a commercial producer, that's probably okay. I maybe should have defined that a little more specifically. We would hope our seed stock producers are still being able to put more selection pressure than that. But we still know that most of our accuracy and intensity comes on the sire side. Females, if you look at the genetic trend lines, females are parallel and dragging behind the sires. And so on the female side, I guess I'm not as worried about that, especially for commercial producers, as long as we're driving that genetic progress on the sire side.
Any other questions? You guys are kind of like me. I tell you, I've always heard that Dr. Bormann was a great classroom teacher, and I was very impressed because you took us on a story, and every time I had a question, you flip the next slide and you answer. And so that, to me, that's how it's supposed to work, and I think she did a fantastic job.
Well, that's a very nice interpretation. I just think people are ready for a steak.
Or that. All right, guys, unless anybody has a quick question, appreciate you guys joining us today.